Hello, everyone. My name is Damian, and I'm a journalist at New Voice of Ukraine. And I would like to introduce you, Anthony Bartaway, editor and correspondent to New Voice of Ukraine, U.S. citizen who lives in Ukraine for a while. And today we are having Q&A session at Patreon because of Jewish New Year. Today is Jewish New Year, and congratulations, everyone who is listening to us today. So, Anthony, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we will go through this, pretty huge list of questions that people sent us.
Yeah. So Shana Tova, everyone. Happy New Year. It is the high holidays. So to just introduce myself, I am a journalist in Ukraine. I've been here for a number of years, like Damien said. Through New Voice of Ukraine, I've covered a number of topics. I've been to the front line. I've covered various religious issues involving both Orthodox Christianity and Orthodox Judaism, two orthodoxies. So I guess believe it is obvious. I'm Jewish myself and have been a part of the Jewish community here, not only as a journalist, but also as a member. So I do have a connection as far as, just personal connections, relationships, traveling throughout the country. Wherever city I go in, I try to stop into a synagogue if there is one. So I have a good overview of how the community works throughout most of Ukraine. Just a short introduction to the Jews in Ukraine. Jews in Ukraine, we've been here for as long as there has been a Ukraine. The very first written evidence of the city of Kiev was actually in the Hebrew language. There was a letter from Kiev to Egypt asking for help, charity, like asking because they needed money because someone fell on hard times. And somehow this letter found its way down to Cairo into the archives there. And that's the first example we have of written out on a piece of paper, the name Kiev. So always been here.
So, 2,000 years passed, and we still need some money, not only money, but also some other stuff. So, Anthony, looks like you're pretty into the topic. So maybe, first let's start with this one. What kind of Jewish organizations are there in Ukraine?
Yeah, so there's quite a lot of Jewish organization in Ukraine. And again, with another history introduction, most of that came after the fall of the Soviet Union. So during the Soviet Union, most religious institutions, most minority institutions were banned. There were some Soviet Jewish organizations that were completely controlled by the state, which no one considered legitimate afterwards. And during Soviet times, there was one working synagogue in Kiev, but it was very heavily surveyed by the KGB. So if you felt strongly enough to go, you were accepting the fact that you were under a constant microscope by the government. So everything came afterwards, really. So right now, there are mostly Chabad. Chabad, if you are familiar with America, they're the ones who will often set up these Chabad houses, they're called, that will kind of minister to Jews in different places. They're kind of the missionaries of the Jewish world, not to convert other people to Judaism, but to get Jews more involved in their own religion. And so because they have this outreach after the fall of the Soviet Union, they were kind of one of the first groups of people in Ukraine setting up synagogues, setting up communities. They brought funding, they brought organization. 9 times out of 10, if you go to a synagogue in Ukraine, it will be attached to Chabad in one way or another, either through the official organization of Chabad or through like a spin-off, like someone who used to be in Chabad, that kind of thing. There's one of the chief rabbis is kind of a dissident Chabad, we can call it. He doesn't really listen to the formal organization so much. The other chief rabbi that we have, Bleich, he is kind of the official government rabbi who is out of Podil, the Podil district in Ukraine. That's the one synagogue that was open during the Soviet Union. It's still open. That's where he is. And he's there for a lot of the government ceremonies because he was kind of the first one around to get recognition. There's also some reform. Reform is kind of the liberal strain of Judaism. As you can tell from me not wearing a kippah and working the very end of Rosh Hashanah, I don't keep the rules that closely because I'm reform. And so there's a community of us in Kyiv. There's a few others around. Once upon a time, there was one in Crimea, but we have a different question I saw that would relate to that a bit. And some other scattered ones. There's various different individual sects who are here because, for example, one of their rabbis is buried here, so they'll have a small presence.
Mm-hmm. I see.
And for the secular side, most people are more involved in the secular side than the religious side. Most Jews in Ukraine are not especially religious, again, because of that Soviet heritage, right? The Soviet Union kind of killed off religion for most people. But the identification as like an ethnic Jew or cultural, just something like that, that's not particularly attached to religion, there are then a whole host. Like it's I'm not going to go through a list because it's a long list of community centers, of communal organizations who handle charity and that kind of thing. And if we look towards the city of Dnipro, that's where the largest community organizations are. The world's largest Jewish community center is located in Dnipro, and it kind of dominates the skyline there. It's very hard to miss.
And of course, this beautiful synagogue in the center.
Yes. Yeah. It's quite large. There's also a museum inside of it that's pretty nice, but there's another question related to that as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's really interesting. And in relation to this, I had something came to my mind. When was started, for us to build like a bridge a little bit also to what happens in Ukraine. So as was started, there is like a community of different religions and religious organizations of Ukraine. I guess it is called All Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations, which unites everyone, like Muslim, both Ukrainian Orthodox churches and also Jewish community. So this organization supported like 100% supported Ukraine. As I understand, how Jewish community, what happened with Jewish community? Did some people just moved out of Ukraine, or they are still here and doing something? How they support? A little bit about it. Can you tell something?
Yeah, so on the first topic of the world, the interfaith organizations, yeah, all the rabbis are kind of represented there. And in fact, one of the offices for it that I've been to before, because I did some volunteer work for the organization you're talking about, they actually run a summer camp in the Carpathians. So here's my side story. So this interfaith group runs a summer camp in the Carpathians, and it's one of the interfaith groups. There's a few. And part of the idea was every day for the duration of this camp, which is like 2 weeks long, it would be themed by a different ethnic group. So there'd be like a Greek day, Armenian day, Jewish day. And then you learn about that group. It was very interesting. And it's attached to this intercultural, interreligious organization. And it's based out of the offices of one of the Jewish organizations, actually. The organizations themselves are all mostly still here. Some of them have, faded away with time, as with any organization does, of course, but all the big ones are still here. If you go to the Central Synagogue, for example, they will often have a truck out front being loaded up with supplies for refugees. During the siege of Kiev, the Central Synagogue was a major shelter for people to stay at during shellings and bombings. They've really gone out of their way to, especially at the Central Synagogue, make themselves a part of the relief. If you go down to Dnipro is a community related to one of Ukraine's billionaires, Ihor Kolomoisky. Don't need to go into him so much. He funded it quite lavishly for a while. So it does have quite a lot of resources. And so even in 2014, the Jewish community was doing a lot with refugee relief, of supporting soldiers, that kind of thing. So it is definitely not different than other Ukrainian organizations in that way, but they've definitely done their part. Like, everyone is kind of doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
For Jews themselves, though, that's where it gets more complicated. As we know, the population of Ukraine today is much lower than it was 3 years ago.
Which,
a lot of people were killed, a lot of people left. And that does include a lot of Jews. Whenever I have traveled to places around Ukraine, visit synagogues, ask them, what's the state of the community right now? One thing that they'll often say is, oh, half of us have left. Partially because of a lot deeper international connections that the Jewish community has here than some others. There's a lot of Ukrainian Jews in America a long time before this that already had very well-established community organizations to help with the wave of people who came after the fall of the Soviet Union. It became easier, I think, for some Jews to leave than some non-Jews. And a lot of them have, for example, gone to Israel. Like, a lot of the times I'll ask them and say, oh, like, some percentage of our community has gone to Ba'aretz, which is like the Hebrew word for, the land. They went to Israel. There was early on a Israeli kind of refugee input center, I guess you can call it, in Dnipro. Back in 2014, I mean, like when the war first began in 2014, a lot of Jews, especially from Donetsk, left. And there's, like I said, there's another question about Donetsk later, I saw. But
yeah, absolutely.
So, but at the same time, kind of waffling between the organizations and the people, yes, a lot of the people left, like a lot of people have left. And the community is much smaller because of that. I've asked this question of mosques as well, and they said, yeah, a lot of our people have left.
But I mean, that's completely understandable. I mean, people, because of security reasons, people are just seeking safer place. Okay, let's go to another one. Actually, interesting question that Putin has presented the war as about denazification. Is there much antisemitism in Ukraine? So I would add actually to this that the whole reason, like, Russia tried to portray motivation to start this war, that Ukraine was supposed to be a kind of the most Nazi state in Europe. So what is your personal experience? What can you say, from day-to-day interaction with Ukrainians?
So in my day-to-day interaction, the thing is, I have to open it up by saying there's anti-Semitism everywhere. There's no place you can go that will not have racism, will not have sexism, will not have anti-Semitism. It is unavoidable. I've seen it here. I've seen it everywhere else. But when I think of Ukraine, one thing that stands out just visibly is that if you go to Western Europe, if you go to United States, a lot of synagogues now will have armed security, will have block posts, like everything, the whole deal, because of the threat of anti-Semitic terror. One thing that I always think back to a few years ago was the Pittsburgh Synagogue Massacre, where a white supremacist went to the synagogue in Pittsburgh and killed a lot of people. That has never happened in independent Ukraine. So when people talk about anti-Semitism, you might hear something a little bit off color sometimes, but ultimately it's perfectly safe here. People don't have any complaints when it comes to incidences of anti-Semitic violence or anti-Semitic harassment. That's actually recorded. And there are organizations that record these things. Ukraine is always very, very low, lower than pretty much anywhere in Europe, lower than the United States, lower than so some people might have some, old beliefs about things. Who doesn't go to any country and ask the old people about some traditional minority group, and you'll sometimes hear something. But when you're talking about Ukraine, like the actual effect that it has on people is completely negligible. With the exception of the Russian bombs, there have been a few synagogues in Ukraine that have been bombed. Mariupol synagogue no longer exists because of Russia.
Okay, I think that's pretty telling. What about Mariupol? I guess there was at least also like a large Jewish community. And what do you know about Jewish communities that gone under Russian occupation? Because almost, I think, 20% of Ukrainian territory is occupied. So what Jews are doing there?
Well, so far as the Jewish community goes, none of the territory that has been taken has been a particularly large center of the Jewish community. Dnipro is safe, and Kiev and Kharkiv are all safe, and those are the kind of the three big ones.
Mm-hmm.
However, if we look back to 2014, to the initial taking of Donetsk, there was a substantial Jewish community in Donetsk, and they had to make some decisions. Do we stay or do we go?
Mm-hmm.
Most left. And so at that time, the Donetsk Jewish community relocated from Donetsk to Kiev. Mm-hmm. So if you go to the Podil neighborhood, you'll find the Donetsk Jewish community. I've been there for holidays a few times. They're very nice people. The rabbi there is the guy who oversees kosher food, like the guy who says that this is the food you're allowed to eat. He's the Donetsk rabbi. And they've had, of course, a lot of troubles relocating because you leave your home, you're a refugee. It's never easy to do. But then a lot of that community went to Mariupol. And like a very large percentage of the Donetsk Jewish community relocated to Mariupol. And then near the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Mariupol was surrounded, and a large percentage of the population of Mariupol is killed, which includes the Jewish community there. The synagogue was completely destroyed, leveled to the ground. And a few months later, the one person went there who was living under occupation and put a Hanukkah there for the celebration of Hanukkah, the candles. So for the Hanukkah holiday, we have a candlestick that has a bunch of arms on it, and someone put that in the ruins of the synagogue as a way to commemorate the whole destruction of that community there. Though some were, of course, able to escape. Many people from Mariupol were able to escape, though with difficulty getting through the Russian lines, of course. This episode's not for that, but very nasty stuff happened in Mariupol. And so these people who were displaced already had to either be displaced or were killed. And so that's like the long term of the people under occupation. The other place that had a more established Jewish community that has been occupation was Kherson. And Kherson has, of course, since been liberated, but that was a regional capital. It had a Jewish community there, had a very large synagogue, actually. I went there before. It was pretty nice. It still exists. Like, don't worry, it's still around. But the complicated question then was, what do you do under occupation? And so members of the Russian army who were Jewish wanted to use that synagogue for themselves. And the rabbi there had to say, do I tell them no? Which is both against my responsibilities as a rabbi. Everyone is supposed to come. But also, if I say no, those soldiers will now label me as an enemy of Russia. And the decision he made was to allow these Jewish Russian soldiers to utilize the synagogue. After the liberation of the city, this led to a lot of questions, of course. Was he a collaborator? And in the various investigations that have happened since then, this was something very tightly examined. He was cleared of wrongdoing. They basically said he was not a collaborator. He was just in charge of this building while Russians took it over. That's it. And so now he is doing a lot of and organizing a lot of humanitarian relief in Kherson, which is a city that's been utterly devastated. And the synagogue is still operating, at least as of the last time I was there. So those questions did have to be raised, and they did have to be answered. And afterwards, after liberation, people did have to ask ourselves, were people collaborators or were they not? And this is a question not just for the Jewish community, it'll be a question for everybody after liberation.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, a lot of questions. Ukrainian teachers, some authorities. So it's actually difficult questions. Okay. The Russians on occupied territories, they tend to, especially when they on territories that they occupy for a while, for at least 1 year or longer. So they tend to do with local communities. They tend to do few things. First, they try to persuade to cooperate. If not, they push these people out, and then they try to create a puppet organization. That happened with Crimean Tatars in Crimea. That happened with humanitarian organization, Red Cross, and some others. Do you know anything about Jewish communities in Donetsk, for example, or in Crimea?
So there was still a Jewish community in Donetsk. There were people who stayed behind and they kind of stayed together. The organization of that is kind of a blur. We know that they did still exist, but with a lot of things with Donetsk, it's completely opaque what the actual administration of anything is there. The issue is more how there have been Jewish authorities in Russia that have tried to direct things, because Russia also has a large Jewish population. The kind of chief rabbi of Russia overall is a bit of a Putin puppet. I'll just say it outright. He's 100%. He exists to give appearance to Putin to say that he's not the anti-Semite. That's the only reason for this rabbi existing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been that, especially more in Crimea, because the Russians have dedicated a lot more resources to organize things in Crimea than anywhere else, even Donetsk, which was occupied for almost as long. And then in the rest of the occupied territories, no one really knows how things are working there. It's difficult to get any information out.
Okay. As usual, I was surprised to know that this year a lot of people from Israel came to Uman. So the question was about the Uman, this religious tourism, that so many people came this year, a third year of war. I think about 20,000. So how and why do they do it? And is it more difficult for them to come to enter the country these days?
Yeah, a brief prologue to that. So Uman, it's a city in central Ukraine, and it is the burial site of a very, very famous rabbi, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. And it's one of the things he said is spend the new year with me, and it's better than New Year anywhere else. So since, the early 1800s, when he said that, a lot of his followers would go to Uman, to where he's buried, to spend the New Year holiday, which is today. So typically, you can get north of like 30,000 people will go to Uman every year. And during the war, it has only slowed down a little. I went this year, and I went early this year, a couple days beforehand, and there weren't so many people there. That was because there are a bunch of canceled flights, mostly related to the Israel-Lebanon war. There were a lot of canceled flights because of that. But what people do now is you used to just be able to fly into Kyiv, get a taxi or a train down, or not train, but bus down to Uman. There'd be a lot of scheduled buses to go down there, and you're there in 3 hours. Now, you can't fly into Kyiv. So what a lot of people will do is go to Poland or Hungary, and it just takes a couple more days of your trip to do that. It's all arranged between the government of Ukraine, the government of the United States, and the government of Israel. A lot of people come from the United States as well, because other than Israel, that's where the most Jews are. And so it's all very closely coordinated to make sure that everything goes, like even during the COVID times, when Ukraine was trying to keep people away from the border, some people were still able to get in for it. There's one funny incident during COVID where they tried to come to the Ukrainian border. It was difficult to coordinate allowing them to come in because of quarantines. And so they all learned the Ukrainian national anthem and Ukrainian folk songs and started singing it to the border guards to convince them that they're fine.
Yeah. I saw this video.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. Mm. But now, of course, with the war, people have to worry about physical danger. Uman has not been touched many times, but that's all relative. They've been bombed 3 times. Not many places you say, oh, we've only been bombed 3 times. That's fine. But that's kind of reality of things in Ukraine, unfortunately. That's considered safe. So now basically what they have to do is they're told to just obey all safety regulations, to listen to the army. The street that this is all on has security. Beforehand, there's no security. Now you have to check your papers and all that.
Mm-hmm.
No selling alcohol, which is kind of a problem because it is a holiday, people of any faith. No being on the street after midnight, which is our normal curfew time, which again, it's a holiday, so they may not be happy about that. And there's wiggle room, of course, with all things, but as long as they follow this security regime in place, it's allowed to go on with a heavy police presence, not only from Ukraine, but also Israel itself does send police to Uman to help in the security situation. Mm-hmm. So it can be done. People came during the Soviet Union times when they weren't allowed to come. They were expressly forbidden to do this, and there'd still be dozens, at least, every year trying to do it and sneaking into the country, meeting in some shed somewhere and doing it anyway. So they're coming no matter what. If it's a religious obligation in their eyes, and that's more important even than personal safety in some occasions.
Yeah. For me, that's just amazing. People are going to, basically country in war to have a holiday to celebrate something. And by the way, did you visit Uman this year or last year?
Yes, I
did you feel here? And does it feel like a holiday, or can you I don't know, Can you feel this or that war is going on?
A little bit, and people do comment on it, like they're aware there's a war going on. Like, it's hard to miss that. They are aware that there are safety regulations. A lot of the people I talk to there are also kind of long-termers who either live there like most of the year. There's a small permanent community there because people come at different times. There's also just the Ukrainian Jews who live there, not just the foreigners who come for this. And people who've been coming every year since Ukrainian independence. So they'll say, I've been coming this whole time and it's important to me, so I'll come. And you feel the tension sometimes, especially like when you ask about it. For these things, you sometimes have to directly ask about it. Like, they're not just going to come out and tell you, like, this is so bad, this is awful, I can't believe we're doing this. But sometimes if you sit and talk with some of the pilgrims, be like, well, I understand it's dangerous. Some of my friends warned me about it, don't go, but it's still important to me. You have to accept danger sometimes, that kind of thing. So it's there, but I feel it more under the surface than immediately identifiable, which honestly in Ukraine is kind of normal. Like, when you go about town, people aren't just griping about how bad the war is all the time. You have to kind of talk to them about it first. It's the same.
Yeah. They're like small talk, Ukrainian small talk. Yeah. That's interesting. And just I think that Uman became for many visitors, like recurrent visitors, like a little bit of their own country, because they're having such a determination to come, even no matter what. So this is amazing. I mean, that's interesting. We have also a question about, of course, about Holocaust. How other countries like Poland or Israel or America have large Holocaust museums, monuments, etc. What does Ukraine have in that direction?
Yes. So this was part of the question prompt that I put out for the call for questions, because in addition to it being the week of New Year, it's also the anniversary of the Babin Yar massacre, when the Nazis first took over Kyiv. Very early on, they brought most of the population to Babin Yar, which was at the time kind of a train station on the outskirts of the city, told them they're just going to be deported into the countryside, and instead they're all killed. 33,000 people were killed. And part of the issue with commemoration of these kind of things is, as always, we have to go back to the Soviets. The Soviet Union, it was not Jews who were killed, it was Soviet citizens who were killed. The Holocaust as such was not a big deal, so they didn't commemorate it. So everything had to kind of begin at independence, more or less. So at independence, for a lot of that time, there was still a difficulty of getting information. So most of what we get in the West about the Holocaust is about survivors from Western Europe. Anne Frank was a German Jew who lived in the Netherlands. And so we kind of heard her story more, because those are the people who ended up in the West at the beginning of the Cold War. There were a lot of victims, a lot of survivors in Ukraine, but they were not heard from for decades because they were behind the Iron Curtain. So when that process kind of had to begin after independence, like I said, which meant opening up Soviet archives, which were always not ideal. And so this idea of the Holocaust in Ukraine, something called the Holocaust of Bullets, because it involved mass executions rather than concentration camps. So there's also concentration camps. It was this early phase when most people were just being shot. So it's a Holocaust of bullets. It was still very, very undercovered in America and Western Europe. But to the issue of how it is now, I'd say that after Euromaidan, actually, something very, very important happened in Ukraine. Well, two important things happened in Ukraine in this regard. First is that there was more civil society in general. Not just Jewish civil society, all kinds of Jewish civil society, which included Jewish civil society. And with that came more interest in Jewish culture, more interest in looking these things up. But the other thing that happened was that the Ukrainian archives were completely opened up to basically whoever wanted them, which was not possible beforehand. And that led to a huge burst in Holocaust research because they have suddenly had easy access to these Ukrainian archives. For museums, there are some. If you go to the World War II Museum in Kiev, there is a rather large exhibit on Babyn Yar. If you go to Dnipro, there is a Holocaust museum that's very well done. It also talks about Jewish victims of the Holodomor. It's a very well done museum. If you go to Babyn Yar today, there are a lot of monuments there. I'd say about half of which were put up after Maidan. And there's been a bunch of, the complicated, like administrative, bureaucratic red tape things that have slowed this process down. But for example, the Babyn Yar, what used to be an administration building there, was being turned into a museum, but that they kind of ran out of money during the war because money is needed elsewhere. So I don't see much improvements now because there's priorities. Every spare dollar has to be spent on things that are immediately necessary. And even people building new parks in Kiev is heavily protested against because money is needed. But overall, that has been a big improvement. Now, is there something similar to the Poland Museum in Warsaw, the Holocaust Museum in DC, Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem? No. A lot of that does come down to funding. And the funding just has not come to Ukraine so much yet, but they've been trying.
Yeah, but I can just say that it's important to understand that Ukraine has its own Holocaust, like Holodomor, and there are even until recently problems with funding to get to the truth about this event. But I think it's down to Jewish community. So there is no censorship or no any problem with this projects. If you want to build a synagogue or to arrange some exhibition about Holocaust, that's no one is prohibiting you. So
right.
That's actually, I want, before we will go to our last slot of questions about Israel. My question is about Ihor Kolomoisky, who is supposed to be, or was supposed to be, like important figure in Jewish community. So he's now imprisoned for numerous economical or bad things that he has done. So what can you tell about him? Was he really so much important for Jewish community? And what Jews of Ukraine thinks about him right now?
Kolomoisky, a complicated figure, Ihor Kolomoisky. But yes, the thing that he's in jail for, well, a lot of things, really. But the main thing that he got in trouble for was he used to be in charge of Privat Bank, the country's largest bank, and was embezzling a ton of money from it, which is why Privat Bank is now publicly owned, state-owned, right?
Yeah, true.
Yeah, so they had to take it over for governance reasons. But Kolomoisky, he was a major funder of the Dnipro Jewish community, which is the best funded, best infrastructured Jewish community in the country.
Mm-hmm.
This is also the community that President Zelensky has his most ties to. So the Dnipro Jewish community influences communities around it. Zelensky is from Kryvyi Rih, which is the kind of second city of that region. So the rabbi in Dnipro is kind of Zelensky's rabbi, basically. But Kolomoisky, we'll do a compliment sandwich of Kolomoisky. So back in 2014, he played a very important role in the defense of the country in that he bankrolled a lot of the volunteer units who were there to fight off the Russians the first time around. And part of that also meant that the Jewish community in Dnipro that he was funding, that he had a lot of influence in, was a part of that support effort. And so we can't write off that part of Kolomoisky until he is still an oligarch, and all oligarchs are criminals. I'll go on on record of saying that now. They're all criminals. But he was a larger criminal than most, it seems. And so he gets in trouble for the thing that we went to, which means that the other one that funded a lot of things in Ukraine was Rabinovich, who was similarly a lot of scandals. And I believe Rabinovich has since fled the country under suspicion of treason. Yeah. So those are the two of the bigger funders, and they're both very problematic, but it has survived after them because it's not just those two people. The Jewish Community Center is still there. They still do a lot of their programming. They still have their synagogue there. They still have their museum there. They still have their humanitarian activities there. If you're an outsider looking in, I don't think you would ever tell the difference between Kolomoisky being there and Kolomoisky not being there.
Mm-hmm.
When you get more into, the rumor mill, who is still loyal to him, that kind of thing. I mean, it's all still around. The personal relationships don't break forever just because someone goes to prison. But from an outsider's perspective looking in, his absence is not exactly missed.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you, Anthony, for this insight. Ukraine is a place where some good things come with bad things very often, especially in politics and when it goes about big money. Okay, so our reader asks, what are the relations between Israel and Ukraine right now?
Again, complicated. I think that at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Ukraine was expecting more help from Israel than it has received. And I think part of that just comes from the perspective of Zelensky. Zelensky is a Ukrainian Jewish man of a very specific age, which meant as he was growing up, this was when a lot of the Jewish community was leaving Ukraine for Israel, when a lot of the connections between Israel and Ukraine were being made. And a lot of Ukrainian Jews saw Israel as a place that was similar enough culturally, because there are so many of them there, because so many Ukrainians, so many other people from the former Soviet Union had went there, that there was closer economic, cultural ties. But better governed is how they saw it. So there's this one joke in Zelensky's TV program, very first episode, Servant of the People, where one of the shadowy oligarchs is talking to another one, and he says, "Oh, you pay taxes? I didn't know you're supposed to pay taxes." And he's like, "Oh no, I pay taxes in Israel. They make you do it there." So that character was a stand-in for Kolomoisky, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. That's what came to my mind.
So there was that image of it being better run and kind of idealized in that way. And so Zelensky was expecting more help to come in, which did not really come. The state of Israel sent basically nothing. They blocked a lot of weapons supplies that they had a hand in. Ukraine was asking for the Iron Dome missile defense system, which never came. Right now, Israel's kind of talking about sending their retired Patriot systems, but no one's heard anything about that recently. Could have just been something mentioned. It might come later. Who knows? And also, Israel is trying to balance its relationship with Russia, because all those things I said about the economic ties between Ukraine and Israel go more so with Russia because Russia has more money. So those ties have always been stronger.
It's not only about money. Also, they have some military bases in Syria, and
Yes,
says that also like security reasons.
Yeah, they coordinate with Russia regarding Syria. They're basically the way that Israel talks to Iran is Israel talks to Russia, then Russia talks to Iran, is how it's been for years. And so because of their own political needs and necessities, they have not wanted to damage their relationship with Russia either. That said, a lot of individual Israelis have come to help, but not so much the Israeli state.
Mm. Do you think, your personal opinion, Anthony, do you think is this the right like course of Israeli politics, or maybe Israel rather should more side with Ukraine against? Because we are, or I will tell you maybe the how most of Ukrainians think that that Iran, Russia are the same thing, like one X. And we are like a lot of people are a little bit surprised because of this Israeli position.
Yeah. I think over time, especially since the beginning of the Gaza war, the Israelis have begun to re-examine that relationship. Partially because Hamas does have a good relationship with Moscow. Shortly after October 7th, there was a Hamas delegation in Moscow. And since then, there has, of course, been the common enemy in Iran. And at one point, some Israeli observers came to Ukraine to basically examine Iranian suicide drones, the Shaheds.
Mm-hmm.
But again, we don't know. There was some information leak that the Israelis kind of terminated that because it was making the Russians mad, but we don't have great information on that either. It's all quite secretive. But in actual practical terms, there has not been any kind of real turn on that issue yet. And right now, as the war in the Levant, I'm going to try and say this as neutrally as you can, has gotten much larger, there are bigger concerns that Israel has than Ukraine. And you would think that they would recognize that Hezbollah is much closer to Iran and therefore much closer to Russia than even Hamas ever was. And the threat of larger war means the threat of larger weapons, et cetera, et cetera. But so far, we have not really seen any concrete changes on that, no.
Okay. Well, Anthony, thank you. I think we covered all questions. And also thanks to everyone who stayed with us for this hour or who will listen this recording later. Happy New Year to everyone involved.
Shana Tova. Okay. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Goodbye.